school choice issue, which is not prevalent in Vermont for those towns that do provide school choice, and that yours is at elementary age. And the majority of school choice for towns are either K through 12 or they're high school, right? Westminster and Westminster West, which is around the Bellows Falls area, has, the oddest one, which is sort of in the middle school. They have two
That's where their
elements.
choice is, middle school.
Yeah, that's where their choice is, which is an oddity. They may be the only one who has that. But if you look at things, like if you're looking at Manchester has an elementary school, but they have public school choice. They have school choice for high school. The interesting thing that no one has brought up in any of these bills and these conversations is that there is a distinction, and it's a pretty big distinction, that could be a cost containment provision for districts like yours, which is that high schools you can designate up to 3. And under the elementary statutory provisions, there is no designation. And so that's interesting to me that they left that out of 483. That's philosophically, I'm just going to say, because I do see that as a potential cost containment that boards could utilize. But, it's interesting is that I had come, and I can't remember when, Ray, and I apologize for that, but I know I had a discussion with this board. And also I'm sorry, when?
Last year about this time, you dealt with Rule 2200 and so forth.
Right.
And other items and what was happening in the
legislature. And other things that were happening. So Rule 2200 exists, and part of Rule 2200 that is going into play right now, if we look at it from sort of a response to the U.S. Supreme Court, is that the independent schools are all either going through an initial approval or a renewal. 483, by the way, had a provision to have a moratorium on approving new schools, which was also interesting to me. But every single one of Vermont's independent schools are going to have to start going through a renewal process. And part of that renewal process is that they have to do an assurance about their non-discrimination. And that's going to be a flashpoint, because you do have some schools that philosophically do not adhere to the same protected categories, right? That Vermont's law says, and I'm specifically talking about religious schools, whether their denomination is Christian or other religious-based schools. That's where you're going to have a problem with the issue of non-discrimination based upon gender orientation issues and things like that. Rule 2200 does still contain an anti-discrimination provision. The House Bill 483 was really trying to hammer home the anti-discrimination as part of the thrust for that. But there still is that issue, and I think it's going to come up for the State Board of Ed, where you have schools, independent schools within your sort of catchment area of where your students go, that have sent assurances that walk that line about what their philosophical religious belief is about marriage and gender orientation issues, as opposed to sort of the full throttled where a non-religious based entity would probably just do the full throttle of, we just don't discriminate, and let's list out all the categories we're supposed to tell you we don't discriminate against, and we're fine with that. So it's going to be interesting to see as renewal applications go through the State Board of Ed of whether or not that's going to be a flashpoint. I don't know politically whether or not they feel that they're in a position to have that fight, but the State Board, yeah. It's interesting. There are some of your districts that are struggling with that. Generally speaking, I have been asked by a couple of districts about whether or not they bring to the attention of the state board that they're concerned that things like under Rule 2200, you have to post your your non-discrimination on your website. You have to do the assurance. Whether or not the local board itself should, as an entity that has to pay public dollars, should be informing the state board, hey, they either don't have that on their webpage, or hey, they don't, they haven't provided the assurance, or this is the assurance that they gave us. I don't know where you all feel about that. I will say this for you, generally speaking, the boards that I've had the discussion with send their kids to some of the same schools that you all potentially are paying tuition to. I think as a entity that has a fiduciary responsibility to your taxpayers, I'm not opposed to the idea of providing the State Board of Ed any concerns that you have about any independent school that is undergoing a review process for approval. And if schools are not responsive, or they seem to do, and sometimes this happens in independent schools, where they seem to impose discipline at a different sort of structure than is permissible, right? A lot of times in independent schools, the complaints that I hear from public school boards are that they just tell a kid it's not a good fit, but in fact what you're actually doing is a de facto expulsion, and kids have due process rights and all of that. If you're running into issues like that and the school's coming up on their renewal process, quite honestly, I think if you're aware as a board that you have every right to and should contemplate informing the State Board of Ed that things of that nature are going on, if there are things that you don't believe are appropriate. So, and that would also cover the assurance issue.
Can we just stop on this point a bit? And one thing that obviously concerns me is what this board is responsible for, and the ways in which we are beholden to the state to provide information about the assurances we see or don't see. I mean, if there is, it would be our two religious schools, only one of which has students this year that we're paying for, where it might come up. But this process probably isn't worked out.
Yeah, it's not
how it's going to be enforced.
Yeah, it's not. And the interesting thing, and Emily Simmons and I had a conversation several months ago where I was very clear with Emily, is that I don't think that there is an affirmative responsibility or obligation on behalf of a public school board to inform the state board. And Emily did not disagree with me. We both, I think, had the discussion and the understanding that if a board were so inclined to do so, I think that a board has the ability to do so, right? You have some standing to do so. And I think the state board should care. Is it something that if you don't do it, that there should be some punishment for a school board? They don't want to get into that fight with us, Ray. I'm not going to take that fight well. There's nothing that gives them the authority to do that.
But who is
They're the
going
right
to notice whether they made these affirmations? I mean, who's going to? I mean, it's the state. The state doesn't have, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think they have administrative capacity.
Well, so I will say this. I think it's a point that's highlighted for the state, that they know that this is in Rule 2200 about the assurance. They also know that the legislature was somewhat fixated on it. They used the term attestation, which is, you're doing it under oath. So yes. That was a little bit of a change in H 483, and that's not going into place, but I think that tells you sort of where they're at. The state board is asking for it as part of their packet. I will say, I did have a conversation with another superintendent about that if they felt professionally that they were obligated to tell the state board, by all means they should do so, but they had no obligation to inform them that they had asked the school for that information. And the school, after they talked to their lawyers, came back with what their assurance was. And you know, from my perspective, I understand they're walking that line. I don't necessarily, I mean, I have a personal opinion on legally how I would weigh in on it. I have no, you know, input on how anybody else would look at it. I think that it's difficult for those schools to do an assurance that would be fulfilling their obligation under the rule.
So Dana, that's my question: is are we as a public board, do we have any exposure if we were to not recognize or act on information that one of these hypothetical schools wasn't doing what they were either or didn't attest to?
So here's how the conversation went. And so if we take a school that is doing a renewal right now, and AOE, by the way, is delayed in their timeline of doing renewals for schools, that probably should not be a surprise to people based upon staffing issues and whatever else. So the school is currently approved. You have exposure if you don't pay the tuition.
Right. I get that. I'm talking about reporting a school that is not living up to the new statute, the one that is going into place.
The rule, yeah.
2022,
200, yeah.
like 200, where, and I'm not saying we'd be a school that would sit on our hands for a district that would do that, but should a citizen decide that, you know, look, these people are doing things that are not congruent with their attestation or whatever, whatever they had to do to meet that standard, can they sue us?
No, because right now, if the school is approved and if they do the attestation or assurance, depending on, you know, if 483, if that language ever goes forward, but if the school does the assurance and the State Board of Ed processes the renewal and doesn't have an issue with it, you have to pay the tuition. If they're in the process of processing the renewal, you have to pay the tuition. And you have no affirmative obligation to do reporting on them for that.
So what is the timeline? So when someone does the renewal, what's the current, what will be the period of time that they are accredited or given approval to receive tuition from us, for example?
So so the last time I talked to Emily was a while ago. So I want to be very upfront about that, Matthew. But there was a school that there were schools that were talking about who they were more than 8 months behind in doing their approval, and so their renewal, I should say, and so their approval covered them still at that point, and I'd have to check and actually see if their renewal went through.
Because the state was delinquent because the state was delinquent in handling this at an appropriate time, right? Mm-hmm. Which adds a whole other level of.
It is, and so it's actually a school that's in your geographic area. Was the one, and I haven't gone back to check to see if they've actually, in fact, moved forward on their renewal. Since there hasn't been an explosion, if they have moved forward on their renewal, they have accepted the assurance as it was provided. Which would not be, in my estimation, the same assurance that, say, the village school would give. The village school, in my view, more than likely would give the one I would say, which is they would list out all of Vermont's protected classes, and they would say, and yes, we don't discriminate against any of these people. So I don't know if the village school has it up on their website, by the way. So I don't know who from here is sort of liaisons with the head of the village school, but I don't think it's inappropriate to remind them that they should have their non-discrimination policy up on their webpage.
I suspect it is. I don't know if,
Yeah, I haven't looked. They probably they tend to do things. They're very good about doing those things. It's also supposed to be in the student handbook too. I'm sorry?
Tim's very aware of the requirement. I have one just point of fact to figure out here. Are they, is the state board requiring everybody at some point now to start renewals, even if they're not in a renewal process, due for a renewal? Or is that kind of like a new starting condition for going forward?
I think my understanding was from several months ago that they were rolling everybody through the reapproval process. Whether or not they're still maintaining that in terms of what their workload issue is, or looking at things to modify that, their point was that they were going to roll through everybody to get it done. And I think that because otherwise, quite honestly, how do you know that they're complying with 80% of Rule 2200 that doesn't go into effect until this July? Right?
So they're doing that in order to assure themselves that the institutions are following Rule 22.
Yeah. I mean, that was my whether or not, like I said, Ray, that they've changed that on that. But the last time I spoke to them in the last couple of months, that's what they were doing.
So that seems reasonable and an intelligent way to proceed. But then the issue for them is basically staffing issues, I would think, at AME to get paperwork done.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's that, right? And I hate to say it because Cat TV is now here, but there's a change in what they're looking at, right? I mean, previously a lot of what they were looking at on renewals, I would say tongue in cheek, it's not necessarily fair overall since Cat TV is here, but basically was the fire marshal needed to basically sign off on the building, right? It wasn't really a lot of information that they were looking for in renewals.
Right.
They're looking for more now. So I think that they understand that they have that responsibility to do so. I think they understand that there is some unsettled feelings throughout Vermont's communities about tuition, right? On one hand, I deal with a lot of towns that do tuition kids out, and it's seen as a positive from the board's constituents, right, from the citizens. And then there are the arguments on the other side of why people don't like it. So there's a lot of, I think they understand it's unsettled. I don't know the impact of Dan French not being the secretary, whether or not there's been a shift in how they view things at all about that.
I guess from my point of view, what I'm trying to understand is what if anything different I have to do in terms of.
I don't think you do have to do anything different, and I think what I would answer is also sort of, I think, what Matthew brought up, and I think it's a conversation for this board. If you have a constituent who comes to you and says to you, hey, my kid is going to school X, and this is a problem that, they said my kid's not a good fit, and so my kid has basically been expelled from the school. I think as a board, you more than likely want to have that conversation about if you think you should forward something on behalf of the constituent to AOE and to the state. I think that as a constituent service, that's not a bad thing to do. I think that's a positive thing to do, but otherwise, I don't think you have a lot that you have to be doing affirmatively. I think the changes in Rule 2200 and how they're going to impact about the admission of kids with special needs, that's going to be something that Kate Abbott's people are going to have to handle. I suspect Kate, Lauren, and Jim and I will have a conversation about, I don't know if you have an assistant director of special ed, Laura maybe knows this, who is assigned to sort of work with what's happening with your special ed, or if Kate Abbott herself is the one who's working it. Because there are assistant directors who are for the Union Elementary School District. There's one that deals with the middle school and the high school, I believe. But it's going to be conversations that IEP teams are going to have training on. And, Laura, Jim, and I have discussed about how we're going to sort of roll that out. We're going to have to roll it out over the summer because that's when the conversations are going to be happening with the independent schools. I think it's also, I think professionally is somewhat of a responsibility to make sure that we're also sort of helping inform independent schools about what the rule changes are for kids with special needs, because they are pretty significant where they do have to do that sort of, the blind admission issue. And then the conversation is about whether or not they can serve the student with special needs. And so I don't think as a board there's a lot that you all are going to be responsible for. I think if 483 pops back up around next legislative session, then or some version of it, I think it's going to be a little bit different. But I think now you're fine.
And basically the IEP team is going to be in charge and control the placement anyway. And if they don't think it works at that particular school, they're going to not.
What I envision more is that, you have some school, there are going to be a couple arguments we're going to get into depending on what independent schools some of your kids' parents choose, if they access them. There are excess cost issues that I think we're going to get into an argument with them. There's some guidance on 504 that came out last summer about talking about excess costs and limiting independent schools in terms of what they can sort of turn back around and bill schools. I have other districts that deal with school choice across the K through 12 who are having that argument of, if you bring in a school social worker, no, you're not going to charge us $60,000 for each kid for the school social worker. We're going to have to talk about what those costs are and how those can be back billed or billed to the school, the excess costs. So those sort of flare-ups, I think, exist now. They're going to continue to exist. I think the big flare-up is going to be that there are some schools that are going to clearly say that they don't believe that they can provide services to a student. And then the is going to have to be from an SU level, I think, since special ed is consolidated there, from a special ed level of having the conversation about, do we provide staff? And do we provide services, and how are we going to address it? Or are we going to accept that an independent school says, hey, we can't serve this kid, and we accept that, and we say to the parent, we accept that they can't do that, and so here's how that can be handled. I don't think there's a lot of benefit of getting into a lot of fights with independent schools about whether or not they can serve some of these kids. You guys have, and pardon me for how I phrase it, but you have the luxury of, you have the village school from its inception made clear that they were going to take and we're getting rid of approval for different categories of disabilities, but they made clear that they were going to take all disabilities, right? And that they were going to educate those kids. And I think, that is a strong factor for them. Not every independent school under that sort of regulatory structure made that choice. There are actually very few that did. The village school and the historic, the Burn Burtons and St. Johnsbury Academy, those guys are basically the only ones that under the 12 categories of disability standard asked to be approved for all 12. So you have schools already that exist that I think where some of the pushback is going to be internally is for the district and for the SU is the conversation about how much do we push to make them open up and to provide those services if they say they can't do it right now for kids who have some disabilities. I think that's going to be the increased area for us.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think it's going to be worked out over a few years, probably.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
even an institution that is approved in all categories, there can still be things that mean it's not possible to serve that.
Oh, absolutely. And so, I think, I think there have been some difficult conversations that the special ed staff have had. There are two I can think about over the last 2.5 years about kids who are residents in your district where, we've explained one is, not being approved for any special ed category and what that means. And at the time under the current sort of setup. And I think there are going to be some of those conversations that we are going to have with independent schools about that. I just to sort of tag back along, it looks like, at least with a very quick search on the internet, the school that I was referring to about where their renewal was held up, it looks like that they're still operating under a renewal that theoretically should have expired in, it looks like 2021. Just to let you know. So, if we trust Google on that.
Right. Well, if 483 is basically plastered on the wall for this session, then I don't think I've got some thoughts about it, but I'll send you what I wrote about it and let you review it and tell me whether I'm crazy or not, because I think that basically 483 was structured by people who forgot to actually think about how non-operating districts operate and the conditions under which their students make those choices. And
I did see what you had sent out an email with 2 documents. I did take a look at.
Yes, right.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. I think you're absolutely right. Is that it's interesting to me that I think you're right. I think there was a blind side of they think it's just schools that do public school choice and they don't get. And I represent a lot of non-operating districts. I have multiple SUs that have, depending on where, depending on what grades, but they have districts that are non-operating. And it's interesting to me where they sort of looked, but I think that's also, familiarity, maybe from a legislative perspective of what's around in their responsibility. I would assume that Brian Campion would understand because
I sent him one of those documents, and I did that in courtesy, and I asked him if I should send it to the rest of the committee members, and he never gave me permission. And he sort of has he maneuvered around certain of the points, but that particular point never came up that I could tell. At any rate, there are other points that could be observed, like basically, I think, 483 would have done something that toward making it for most non-ops. I don't know all the non-ops, so there's a wide diversity, as you pointed out. But for our particular non-op situation, K6, we have an obligation to provide a public education for all the children of our district who choose to accept, to go make a choice and go to any of the institutions that are available that are approved. But there could be conditions under which we could not meet that for a child in a particular grade situation. And the fact that they were going to constrain independence to accept any child that made that choice, basically, was actually going to be helpful in one respect, because in fact the public school districts do not have to accept a child as long as they do it in a non-discriminatory way, and they have reasons based on their policies about class size or it's in our policies for accepting non-district residents, which I don't know, somebody, maybe Stitzel wrote it, maybe Bob Fletch, I don't remember. But it clearly takes section 1093 of 16 and applies a total admissions process to it. And it says it's supposed to begin at the application of the child. Now, I don't know that any of the schools our children have attended in the SDUSD have ever applied those requirements, but it's there, and they could, which puts the point that was being made by certain members of the committee and by testimony was that public schools accept all children, but from a non-operating point of view, they don't accept all children, but they don't have to accept all children that may choose them. And that's a pretty significant difference. And I thought that they could have taken that into account in this legislation, because they could have worried about that problem. They didn't worry about that problem. They thought there was a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. So BSBA has and I just looked at it for another school district and had to explain to them. BSBA has a model policy on the admittance of non-resident students, like parentally placed non-resident students. And it's interesting to me is that there are a couple things. Statutorily, a public school can, if a student has been, and hopefully it shouldn't be happening K through 6 for various reasons, but if a student's been expelled by a public school, then another public school can accept the expulsion and not take a kid. Not accept the student. Most of the policies do sort of have a trigger for, class size, right? Whether or not they need to maintain class size.
Yes.
Yeah, which is interesting. They cannot do it for discriminatory reasons such as, and I had to have a lengthy conversation about based upon if you get a kid who has special needs, right?
Yeah.
They can't do it based on that. I have to tell you, you guys are non-operating, but you flip it for when I'm talking to a district that is a public school, and I have to be concerned and highlight the issue of, if you're gonna let kids in, you can't do it in a, you can't discriminate. You are a public school. You're a federal recipient. You're subject to Vermont's public accommodations law. And so you want to be very careful if you even open your door to some of the things.
Be very careful, but 1093 says, under such terms and restrictions as it deems best,
Yeah.
which is pretty broad.
Yep, and and I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think that they are trying to open the door for independent schools to have to let in kids and enroll kids that they've never had to enroll before. I don't think that's a negative thing. I think there are going to be some growing pains for that, right?
Yep.
And it's going to be interesting, but yeah, they should be making it across the board very clear, right?
Yeah.
It should be an equal standard. If you're going to impose it on an independent school because they get public tuition dollars, then you should be imposing it on a public school because they're a federal recipient and subject to anti-discrimination.
And they will be receiving tuition loans.
And they'll be receiving public funds, right?
That's right.
And who's looking at the school that says well, I'm sorry, we would love to have this child, but given that their particular grade level, we're maxed out. We can't do this, even if the reason is actually something different.
Yeah.
We have that actual situation.
I know. Yep. And my concern is that's who's going, all right, show us the evidence that you, and why isn't it then they don't have to hire more staff to deal with the overflow or whatever. I mean,
I think those are all. I think that's a valid point and a valid question, Matthew. They would argue, and Millmore would argue that they have a right to have distinctive criteria, right? I think, Ray, you brought up the issue. I deal with the Killington Mountain School. I've got
Winhall or Stratton.
And Stratton has one. Right, you brought up Stratton, and those are very particular and very directed programs. Now, I will tell you this: the Killington Mountain School during COVID, however, opened its program up to where they were doing online, and they were more than willing to take kids that I don't believe that they would have taken in another sort of situation, right? Because
I'm familiar with this school because I worked there. I used to work there.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole other side of the thing, right? Like the specialty school thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're just here to, somebody wants to learn how to ski, or if they have a particular skill, as opposed to maybe schools where the kids might, lack the skills necessary for. Where do they stand on that? I'm sorry to interrupt you because is this anything in litigation right now with them, or it's just
No, it's not. And the analogy, the analogous sort of public school debate was that there was several years ago, and it's been changed, but the CTEs had to be it had to be hammered home to them is that they also had to do blind admissions about kids and not know that kids were receiving special education service and make the decision on enrollment prior to knowing that.
Who did you say had to do that?
It's the tech centers are not supposed to be making decisions based upon that. And I have to say, it occasionally pops up for me that you get a kid that the question becomes, can we serve them? And we have that conversation of, well, let's talk about what are the services you're putting in for that kid. And I expect we're going to have it with independent schools.
I listened to a CTE director talking to the Senate Ed Committee, and they have an admissions process. And they don't, they're 30% or 40% of the applicants they don't accept. They said, they try to help them find places.
Yeah.
And Brian Campion used that in the discussion that I saw on May 2nd about, pointing out that there was an admissions process for a public institution, and and I had pointed out to him that our policies have an admissions process for non-resident students as well.
Mm-hmm.
That needs to be factored in there. And I had one other point, which is maybe slightly contentious, but there was claims from various people at various times in testimony that, you know, that in fact, Steer made this point in the May 2nd discussion, that, you know, any student that goes to a, you know, independent and receives and cards their tuition with them from their district is harming public schools. And I'm saying to myself, well, that's not true. If they're going to a public school, they are actually benefiting that public school because they're bringing money in a substantial quantity. And I just find the arguments so absurd. It's not well thought through at all. And
if you placed a limiter on it and said that if you're sending it to a private independent school, then I would understand. But
in that case, that's not even an issue, because if they're coming from a non-operating district, it's the non-operating district that's raising the money. You know, it's not taking it away from any of the public schools around it.
Under how it's structured now, I wouldn't disagree with you. I always chuckle about being a former resident of Colchester, Vermont, and several years ago, the superintendent was thrilled that the schools on the islands had to send their kids off island to they tuition their kids off. There's no high school on the islands, Grand Isle, Alberg, and all of that, and it was beneficial enough for the Colchester School District that they sent buses up.
Yes.
And I don't disagree.
I heard about too.
I don't disagree with you on that. I don't know if I agree with you of taking it out of where it would go to another public school and help fund public school, but instead sending it to an independent school. You haven't convinced me yet, right? I'll have to think about that.
It strikes me that, public schools construct their budgets for the students they expect to have.
Yep.
And they set it up to be well enough funded, right? So I just find that a little bit kind of a slippery piece of logic there that people like to throw in. I see this often, and I don't want to get off into this, Diane Ravitch's point, which there may be some truth in a lot of different situations, but I think the way Vermont has structured this program, I don't think there's so much truth to this.
Yeah, I think
dollar for dollar taking away this stuff from the public system, and and these legislators go, well, if we didn't have this, our public schools would be fortified and healthy and all that. And it's just,
well, the public schools have the ability to raise the funds that they need, and if in this state if that's not being done, it's because of the constraints of their received tax problems and local property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not going to change until that changes. Then I don't think the argument has much in the way of legs. So, at any rate, this has been interesting. I'm thankful that you came and told us what's happening. I didn't see a vote, so I guess I knew this was the correct situation, that it was being left on the wall, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean it's a heavy lift to get it right, and I have to tell you, I would prefer that they wouldn't just pass something for the sake of passing something.
Thank goodness for that.
right? You know, to say to their constituents, "Hey, we tried to address your problems." You know, it's a multi. I think it's a multi-year sort of review on what the best sort of scenario is, and there still is, and I do not have an update on it, but there still is the issue of that the state of Maine changed its tuitioning program to deal with the Carson decision.
Carson Macon, yeah.
And I'm not sure where that stands, other than the fact that I'm quite sure they're probably getting sued. So you know, it'll be interesting to see, and that's multi-years, right, where that's going to happen out. But if they're getting sued, so it's going to on that level, it's going to be interesting if you're looking at that one facet of independent schools. But I think overall, you know, I have to be honest with you, the independent school issue overall, if we take out the Carson decision, the concern is of quite frankly, of supporting and providing access to kids with special needs. I think that's the area that has to be done correctly from the legislature, how they address that.
Yes, I agree with that.
That's sort of my, you know, I step out of the attorney's role and say that as a human being.
You know, we were quite conscious of that when we made this change, that we were going to take care of that as best we could.
Right. Yeah.
And
you know, is that the Maine's approach to this? Where can I find that?
I'd have to look it up. I haven't looked at it in a while because I was so thrilled that I didn't have clients being sued anymore after we finally settled everything out. But let me take a look, Matt, and I will see if I can get an update, and I'll send it out to you all about it.
Just to see what angle they're coming at it, you know, to sidestep the Carson thing, but.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, there's still a lot of fight on the opening up access to public tuition. There's a lot of fight, and there's a lot of money and a lot of support on that side, and that's not going to change. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess depending on your take.
Unfortunately, the state isn't.
So we have a different Supreme Court.
Yeah, correct. Right. So I will take a look, Matthew, and I'll try and get an update on that one. But literally, I have to tell you, when the last client stopped being sued and had a settlement, I was thrilled. You know, on a certain level. So I haven't gone back to visit it, but we'll see.
It's done.
Right. So yeah, I mean, thank you guys, and I'm sorry. And if something changes and somebody becomes a rebel and they really think they're going to push this through, I will absolutely let you all know. But every indication I'm getting is that they know they can't do it.
The only thing I saw was that this morning, I guess, was that they might try to put some of this into the general budget stuff.
Yeah, they may try and put some of it into the general budget stuff. I have not looked at the budget bill. It's huge. But that may be where some of it slips in. That tends to be.
That could be snuck in.
They can tend to, if they think they've got the votes for it, yeah, they can sneak it in. Some of it. But I think their focus is, if they're going to do that, is going to be more on the provision of making sure that students with special needs are, I think that's where they're going to focus. Because I think that's the least controversial piece of addressing it, right? I think that's the one that most Vermonters can get behind.
Sure. And Rule 2200 should pretty much do that, shouldn't it?
It should. You know, it was interesting, some of the differences where, you know, it's sort of after the fact stamping what the State Board of Ed has promulgated through regulation.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that that's how they chose to do it. But yeah, Rule 2200, I think it's going to be interesting. I think there's some confusion with independent schools about sort of how the process is going to be working for them as well. I think that the independent schools had a bigger ability to have a say in Rule 2200 than they necessarily did in H 483.
Right.
So, So it's,
that they didn't have much say in this process because they excluded the organization acronym starting with D
oh,
from
did,
Visa from any testimony
oh, that's
that I saw. I never saw them at the Senate end. I don't know if they got into,
Into the
but they
House.
complained they weren't invited into the House deliberations.
That's interesting. Okay.
So you had this parade of the initial organizations that begin with D, like
Right.
the SBA, the SA,
The superintendents.
the EPA, etc., and the Vermont NEA as the well, that's, I guess, I don't know, union's not a nonprofit, is it? I don't know. At any rate, they all paraded, they all made their testimonies, and multiple times in some cases. So.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
didn't
the
realize
only
that.
the only independent schools that were some individuals like several of them testified. I saw some of their testimony, and there was some actual. There was a woman who testified about switching her child from a public school to an independent because in public school, child was learning nothing. So, and then there was I don't know how I will go further into this because it's the stuff I saw, and there you could watch it on the Senate live cam. Although the acoustics in that room are not great.
No,
So
they're not. It is difficult at times to hear things clearly there. But yeah, no, I will let you all know if somehow they do fling it into the budget bill too.
Okay, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you all. It's always nice to talk to you guys once a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Really,
I think we'll keep this up because the legislature is likely to provide some new interest every year.
Absolutely. But, so I would also expect that, relatively shortly after the closed BSBA is going to also send out their legislative report too.
Yes.
So if that raises I shouldn't say problems, if that raises questions, by all means, just shoot me an email, Ray,
I will do that. They raise my hackles every time I get there.
I know it does, and I get emails from you at like 1:00 in the morning. So,
sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I didn't see it until 5, so I think that was perfectly okay. But I'm a little concerned that maybe you should be getting.
I just know it was 1:00.
Oh shit, right? I mean, I'm sorry, but yeah, the dude needs more sleep.
The dude needs more sleep. I'm a proponent of sleep if they get older. But
right.
yeah.
Well,
So it was very nice.
Yeah. It's very nice to have you. I appreciate your honesty, courtesy, and your
Productive.
kind of common sense.
Yeah, I can't change myself, so I'm glad that it works for you all.
Definitely works for me.
So like I said, if there are any questions that pop up, by all means, please let me know.
I will do so.
All right, and you guys have a great summer and everything that's coming up. Hopefully everything's relaxing for everybody.
We'll try.
All right.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you very much.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
I think we'll declare ourselves adjourned. I have nothing else to say unless someone else has something to say. We're just adjourned.